Yesterday, for the first time ever, the heads of the FBI and the UK's MI5 shared a public platform addressing business and academic leaders in London. And they did so to send a strong, clear message on the serious and increasing threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to our countries and really to the entire world. Now, here with me to talk about this is China expert Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. He can be found on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Now, I'm sure this did not catch you by surprise, although this is quite significant for two agencies, one from the UK and one from the US, to be so public in alerting the world to this threat.
FBI Director Wray's comments were things that we have heard before for the last couple of years. But what did take me by surprise, Tony, was that he was sharing the stage with Ken McCallum, who is, as you point out, the head of MI5, domestic intelligence in the UK. And really the message was, this is a threat not just against the United States, and it was not just against the UK, but it's across the Western world, and indeed the world, the partners of the Western world. So China right now is in a difficult position because they can't say, oh, it's just America.
So, I mean, given the fact that, as you said, this is unprecedented, I mean, does this tell us something to the degree of the threat, how serious it is? Does this tell us something?
It tells us something about the degree of the threat. But it mentioned, we've heard that before. What I think is important is that you are seeing partners of the U.S. say this, and also the Biden administration doing this in a much more public way. I think that this is a symptom of a change in mentality in Washington, where even in very high-profile platforms, we are now seeing more honest conversations about China. In the past, we didn't have those. And now I think that it's important that we are going in that direction. So that's why I think that yesterday's announcement or yesterday's event was so significant.
Could possibly part of this be to box China in when it comes to Taiwan? Because Director Wray yesterday warned that if China was to forcibly take Taiwan, of course he's speaking to business leaders, he said, quote, it would represent one of the most horrific business disruption the world has ever seen, end quote.
There is some of that there. But really what the Biden administration should be doing is forcing American companies off Chinese soil. And unfortunately, President Biden has been taking actions to encourage American companies to stay in China. So for instance, when Biden talks about waiving tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs that President Trump imposed in 2018, in fact, we know that a number of companies which were thinking of reshoring, in other words, bringing their operations back to this side of the Pacific, they stopped those efforts. So I think that Director Wray's comments were important, but it's really up to the president now to take those actions to really give meaning to Director Wray's words.
You know, Gordon, there was also some reference in yesterday's conversation about the lessons that China has learned based on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What have they learned from that?
Well, they've learned a number of things. The most important, Tony, I believe, is the failure of deterrence. The United States, the European Union, and Great Britain had an economy 25.1 times larger than Russia's at the end of last year. And yet we failed to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, even though there was perfect intelligence on this. And I think China's looked at that and said, well, you know, if they failed with regard to Russia, they're certainly going to fail with regard to China. And the other thing that I think that China's learned is that although American sanctions and the sanctions effort was somewhat important, it has not been effective enough to stop Russia. And I think China's thinking, well, you know, we don't have to worry about American-led sanctions. So those are two very bad messages that Beijing has taken on board recently.
So with that in mind, Gordon, should the game plan for the U.S. be changing and adapting to a different landscape now?
Oh, absolutely. with regard to Taiwan, for instance, we've had this policy of strategic ambiguity where we tell neither Beijing nor Taipei what we would do in the case of imminent conflict. Now, that worked, obviously, but it worked in a benign era, and we are no longer in a benign era. We need to be much more specific. The Biden administration, I think, needs to be clear that the United States will defend Taiwan. Biden has said that on a number of occasions, 3 of them, in fact. But after each of those occasions, his White House and the Defense Department have walked those comments back. And I think that has not been a good lesson that Beijing has seen, because what they're saying is that the United States is in disarray, at least under the Biden administration. So that's, again, another bad message, another bad signal that we're sending to Beijing.
Yeah, it's a bad message, but not necessarily a untruth. It is a reality, I think, unfortunately. Gordon Chang, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Tony.